My name is Madeline Carter. I am 33 years old. And I live in Evanston, Illinois, working as a marketing director for a tech company. For as long as I can remember, I have been the daughter who stayed quiet, the one who planned every holiday, who cleaned up every spill, who gave and gave while my brother and sister were praised for their success. On Christmas night, I thought I was just keeping the tradition alive, making sure my father's dinner looked perfect. But as glasses clinked and 25 relatives looked on, he laughed and called me the family doormat. In that instant, the years of being overlooked, dismissed, and erased rose to the surface. And for the first time in my life, I did not swallow it. I stood. I spoke. And what happened after that turned our family upside down in a way no one expected. Stay with me, because you will want to see how far the truth can reach once it finally breaks free. Snow kept falling in lazy flakes outside the wide windows of my parents' home in Evanston. Soft and quiet, against the glow of the street lamps. Inside, the warmth of the fire and the twinkle of the Christmas tree made everything look like a picture from a holiday card. The dining room table stretched nearly wall to wall, set with china my mother only used once a year. Relatives pulled off coats, shook snow from their boots, and filled the house with voices. Laughter echoed as cousins hugged each other, and the scent of roasted turkey mixed with pine from the tree. To anyone else it was a perfect Christmas evening. To me, it was another night where I had done most of the work and would be noticed the least. I moved quickly from one end of the room to the other, checking the candles, adjusting the centerpiece, slipping back into the kitchen to stir the gravy. No one saw me. But if I disappeared for 5 minutes, they would have noticed something was missing. That was my role. The invisible hand that kept the evening together. My father stood by the entry, greeting guests like he was the one who had orchestrated it all. He shook hands, clapped backs, told everyone how wonderful it was to see them. People complimented the decorations, and he smiled as if the house had dressed itself. Not one word about the daughter who had spent days preparing every detail. Rebecca arrived with Emma and Luke in matching red sweaters, and the room erupted in applause at how cute they were. I bent down to help Luke take off his snow boots before he ran across the carpet, but Rebecca barely looked my way. She was already busy telling my mother about a research award she had won at the hospital. Gregory followed close behind, loud and confident, carrying a single bottle of wine as if it were a crown jewel. My father's face lit up when he saw him. He embraced Gregory like a soldier returning from war, proud to parade his son, the lawyer, in front of family and friends. I slipped past them into the kitchen to pull the rolls from the oven before they burned. By the time everyone was seated, nearly 25 people crowded around the table. The children were at a smaller table nearby, already giggling over candy canes. My Uncle Frank had planted himself near the bar cart, red-faced and cheerful. Thomas Green, my father's longtime friend, sat across from him. He owned a restaurant in town and never missed a Carter holiday. He raised his glass, admiring the table settings, and said our family always knew how to put together a perfect night. My father chuckled, acting humble, and said it was all teamwork. I stared down at my plate, knowing teamwork meant me carrying the load while everyone else enjoyed themselves. Platters of food passed around, voices rising in conversation. I jumped up to refill the breadbasket, slid more butter onto the table, and carved turkey for the children. Every time I tried to eat, someone asked for something, and I rose to fetch it. My father nodded in satisfaction, like he approved of how well I served. At one point, Emma spilled her juice, and I was already there with napkins, moving plates, keeping the tablecloth from being ruined. Guests laughed lightly and called me quick. My father grinned and said every family needed someone dependable. It was meant as a compliment, but it cut deep. Dependable was all I had ever been to them. David sat with my cousins farther down the table. He was quiet, polite, and clearly noticing everything. When our eyes met, he gave me a look that said he understood. Later, when I passed behind him with a tray of coffee cups, he whispered that I deserved to sit and enjoy myself. I smiled faintly, touched by his words, but I knew if I stopped moving, no one else would step in. They expected me to keep things seamless. It was easier to keep working than to fight their expectations. As dinner went on, the conversation shifted to successes of the year. Gregory launched into a long story about his law firm winning a high-profile case. Relatives leaned in, nodding, clapping him on the back. My father raised his glass and praised Gregory's brilliance, saying he was destined for partnership. Then Rebecca spoke about a rare diagnosis she had caught at the hospital. Everyone gasped in admiration, telling her she was saving lives. My mother squeezed her hand proudly. My chest ached, listening to the admiration pouring over them. When someone asked about me, my father waved a hand and said I had helped get the evening ready. Just like always, the subject shifted almost instantly, leaving me invisible again. I tried to swallow down the sting and focus on the food. I had baked pies the night before, carried them here carefully. Yet when dessert was served, my mother walked in with the pecan pie, smiling as people complimented her baking. She promised to send my aunt the recipe. I stood beside her, slicing it neatly, keeping silent. She had bought cookies from the bakery that morning, which I had plated and arranged. And still, she was praised for those too. I slipped back into the kitchen with the dirty dishes, listening to the laughter behind me. My hands trembled as I turned on the faucet, hot water running over the plates. It was like washing away every small piece of myself no one else ever noticed. Later came the gifts. Wrapping paper flew across the living room. Emma squealed over a dollhouse. Luke hugged a toy truck. My parents handed Gregory a sleek leather briefcase, and the room applauded at how fitting it was. Rebecca opened diamond earrings, and my mother cried as she fastened them into her ears. When it was my turn, my father slid an envelope across the table. Inside was a gift card to a department store. He patted my shoulder and told me to buy something nice. I smiled politely, thanked him, and tucked it into my pocket. The difference between me and my siblings was plain, but no one mentioned it. They clapped and moved on. By the time music played softly from the speakers and people leaned back full from dinner, my body ached from moving nonstop. My hands smelled of soap. My feet throbbed from hours of standing. And still, I was the one clearing glasses and pouring more wine. I paused for a moment by the window. Outside, snowflakes drifted down slowly, blanketing the street in silence. The houses across the road glowed with warmth. Silhouettes of families gathered together. I pressed my palm to the cold glass, grounding myself. Inside this bright, noisy house, he had never felt more alone. When I turned back, I saw my father at the head of the table, standing tall, glass raised, ready to speak again. Guests hushed, waiting for his words, their faces expectant. Gregory leaned back in his chair. Rebecca touched her earrings. My mother folded her hands delicately. I slipped back into my seat in the corner, hands folded in my lap, my smile practiced and polite. The storm inside me rumbled low, quiet for now. But it was there. The night was not over, and I knew there was more yet to come. I watched my father lift his glass again, his booming voice filling the dining room as he launched into another story about Gregory's brilliance at the firm. Everyone leaned in, their eyes shining with admiration, while my mind slipped away to other nights, other tables. When the spotlight had never touched me, I thought back to the spring of 2010, the day I graduated from high school. I had worked harder than anyone else in my class, delivered the valedictorian speech, and walked across the stage with honors. When I looked out into the crowd, the seat where my parents were supposed to be was empty. They were hundreds of miles away, driving Gregory to an interview at Columbia Law. I told myself they had no choice, that it was important for his future. But the hollow ache of standing alone never left me. 2 years later, on the night of my 21st birthday, I had invited my friends to a small celebration at a restaurant in downtown Evanston. I was excited, proud that I had saved enough to pay for it myself. That afternoon, my mother called to cancel. Rebecca had been accepted into Northwestern's medical program, and the family wanted to celebrate her achievement. I smiled politely. told my friends something had come up, and blew out a cupcake at home by myself. The candle flickered in the dark kitchen while laughter from my neighbors drifted through the walls. When I finally earned my degree in marketing from the University of Illinois in 2014, I felt for once that my parents might see me. I walked across that stage again, this time with my diploma in hand. And when I found them afterward, they smiled politely and asked about Gregory's bar exam and Rebecca's summer research project. My degree seemed like a footnote in someone else's story. In 2017, I bought my own little house in Evanston. It was not grand, but it was mine. I had saved every dollar, picked the neighborhood carefully, signed the papers with trembling hands. At my housewarming party, I had filled the rooms with balloons and finger food, proud of what I had built on my own. My parents arrived, and within minutes, they were talking about Gregory's courtroom victories and Rebecca's residency. Guests left that night knowing everything about my siblings and almost nothing about the woman who had hosted them. I thought of 2019 when Grandma Margaret grew ill. I was the one who drove her to appointments, picked up her prescriptions, and sat with her in the evenings when she could not sleep. When she passed away that winter, I handled the funeral arrangements. I chose the flowers, wrote the obituary, greeted people at the service, while my parents wept quietly in the front row. Family friends praised Rebecca for coming home from the hospital just in time to be present. I was invisible, even in grief. The memories pressed down on me as I sat at the Christmas table in 2023, watching my father beam at Gregory. My chest felt tight as I remembered the times I had been asked to give, to sacrifice, to stay quiet so someone else could shine. Even money had been part of it. In 2018, Gregory had asked me for a loan of $3,500 to buy a new car. He promised he would pay me back in a year. 5 years later, I was still waiting. Rebecca had called me countless times when her babysitter canceled, and I had rearranged my schedule to watch Emma and Luke. They adored me, and I loved them. But the way she spoke made it sound like I owed her that time because she was a doctor. I returned to the present when my father clapped loudly and raised his glass again. He toasted to family, to success, to being proud of his children. His words barely touched me. And when he did glance in my direction, it was with the same familiar smile, the one that said I was useful but never remarkable. I swallowed the bitterness like stale wine. David's eyes caught mine across the table. Steady and calm, he tilted his head as if to remind me to breathe. My pulse slowed, but my hands stayed clenched in my lap. I heard my aunt whisper to my mother about how lucky she was to have such accomplished children. My mother nodded, her eyes glistening. Though she did not glance my way, I focused on my plate, pushing food around, remembering again how many holidays had played out just like this one. Thanksgiving after Thanksgiving, Easter after Easter, birthdays, anniversaries. Every gathering fell to me to plan. I remembered one Thanksgiving where I cooked the entire meal, turkey and all, only for my father to thank my mother at the table for hosting. I remembered Easter egg hunts where I stuffed candy into plastic eggs until midnight, only to watch Rebecca collect praise for how happy her children were. I thought of the late nights at my own house, scrubbing dishes after relatives had left, counting the money I had spent, reminding myself that family was worth the cost. But here I was again, years later, still invisible, still the background character in a story that revolved around everyone else. As dessert plates were cleared and the sound of wrapping paper filled the air from the living room, I leaned back slightly, studying the faces around the table. My brother sat tall, full of pride. My sister sparkled in her new earrings. My parents looked content, satisfied that their family image was polished and admired. And me, I was the one with sore feet, dry hands, and an envelope with a gift card in my pocket. I forced myself to smile when little Luke ran over to show me his toy truck. His small arms around my neck reminded me of what love should feel like. Simple and pure. I hugged him tightly, then sent him back to his pile of toys. The noise swelled again. Laughter and chatter and clinking glasses, and I felt my chest tighten with the weight of 33 years. I sat quietly, sipping the last of my coffee, letting the memories blend with the present moment. Each one stacked on the other like the dirty dishes piling in the sink, heavy and impossible to ignore. And as my father prepared to make another toast, I knew the night was only moving towards something heavier, something that had been waiting to break free for a very long time. My father's voice carried easily over the room, rich and commanding. As he launched into another story about Gregory's latest win in court, the table grew quiet. Heads turned toward him as though this tale was the highlight of the evening. Gregory leaned back in his chair, a satisfied grin spreading across his face, enjoying every bit of attention. I sipped my water, the cool taste grounding me, and tried to ignore the way my father's words made me feel like a stranger among my own family. He praised Gregory's sharp mind, how his firm had trusted him with a complex corporate negotiation, and how he had secured a settlement worth millions. A few cousins clapped politely. My aunt asked questions, impressed by the details, and Gregory soaked it in. My father's chest swelled as though he himself had argued the case. I pressed my fork into the tablecloth just to give my hands something to do. When the applause faded, Rebecca spoke up. Her voice was smooth, practiced, the way she often addressed worried parents in the pediatric ward. She described a little boy she had treated that fall, how she had caught a rare condition early and spared him from years of suffering. My mother's eyes filled with tears as she declared her daughter a true angel. Rebecca smiled modestly, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear, clearly used to being admired. My father raised his glass again and toasted to his brilliant children, his lawyer and his doctor, his voice filled with pride. And he repeated the words twice, as if making sure everyone at the table understood that his children had made it, that they had justified his long years of hard work. His eyes did not settle on me. I sat just a few feet away. But it felt like Miles. When a cousin asked about me, my father gave a small shrug and said I had helped with the dinner, that I was always good at organizing things. His tone was light, dismissive, as though my entire life could be summarized by setting a table and keeping things orderly. The conversation moved on almost immediately. I felt my cheeks burn, though no one else seemed to notice. I cut a piece of turkey that had already gone cold and pushed it around my plate. My mind traveled back to the projects I had led that year at my firm. The long nights creating campaigns that had driven real growth. The praise from my manager when I landed a major software client. I wanted to stand and say I was more than napkins and serving platters. Instead, I stayed quiet. Thomas Green, my father's friend, leaned forward and told my parents they must be so proud. My father nodded and said he was blessed. My mother smiled, though she avoided my eyes. The silence in that small gap, the part where my name should have been, felt heavier than anything else. I noticed the way David shifted in his chair, his jaw tight. He caught my eye across the table and gave the faintest shake of his head, as if telling me not to let it break me. I swallowed hard and forced my lips into a small smile, though it felt brittle. Emma tugged on Rebecca's sleeve, wanting more pie. Rebecca passed her plate down to me without a word, as if I were the server instead of her sister. I took it, my hand steady, and scooped a slice with practiced ease. When I set it back in front of my niece, she grinned and thanked me sweetly. That softened me for a moment, but the sting of being treated like a helper lingered. The music from the speakers shifted to a softer carol, and for a brief moment the room fell into an easy hum of chatter and clinking glasses. I looked around at the glowing faces, the way everyone leaned toward Gregory and Rebecca, and I realized nothing would ever change if I stayed silent. My father's words had been small, but the impact was sharp, invisible again. I thought. The same role I had played all my life. I rose quietly and carried a tray of dishes into the kitchen. The sink was already piled high, steam fogging the window above it. I set the plates down harder than I meant to and braced my hands against the counter. My reflection stared back at me from the dark glass of the window, tired and drawn. I thought of the years I had carried this role, the times I had smiled through the ache, the excuses I had made for my parents, for my siblings. My stomach twisted. Voices floated in from the dining room, still full of cheer. My father was retelling an old story about Gregory winning a debate championship in high school. Rebecca laughed, correcting some detail, and they carried on as though no one was missing. I wiped my hands, squared my shoulders, and returned to the table. No one noticed I had been gone. My seat remained empty, untouched, like I had never left. I slipped back into it, folding my napkin neatly in my lap, and glanced around. My father's hand rested on Gregory's shoulder. My mother leaned toward Rebecca, listening intently. No one leaned toward me. I picked up my glass of water and took a slow sip. My throat was dry, but not from thirst. It was from words I had been swallowing for years. The chatter swelled again, a wave I had been treading all my life. My father laughed loudly at his own joke, and everyone joined in. I forced myself to smile, to keep the peace, but inside my chest, something pressed harder, like a dam straining against the water. I could feel it shifting, threatening to give way. I set my glass down carefully and looked at the twinkling lights on the tree in the corner. They sparkled bright, almost mocking. While I sat in the shadows, my breath came slow and steady. But inside, the storm grew. I knew I was reaching a point I could not step back from, though no one else seemed to notice. The evening had only deepened, and I felt myself inching closer to the edge. My father's glass rose high above the table, the reflection of the chandelier catching in the red wine as he prepared to speak again. His voice carried with ease, filling the room with the same booming confidence that had shaped so many of our family gatherings. He began by thanking everyone for coming, his tone full of pride. And then he slipped into stories about years gone by, about triumphs, about lessons he believed he had passed down. The room leaned in, warm with attention, hanging on his every word. The story twisted until once again it centered on Gregory. A courtroom victory turned into legend, a symbol of Carter pride. Laughter followed, the kind of laughter that cemented my brother in the role of golden son. Then my father shifted his gaze to Rebecca, recalling her tireless hours at the hospital and how patients' families would never forget the angel who had saved their children. He raised his glass again and the room followed. Their applause filled my ears, but it felt like a drumbeat that pounded only against me. Then it happened. My father chuckled and said something that sliced through the noise and left me cold. He gestured toward me with a casual wave and said that every family needed someone to soak up the mess. Someone who never complained. A doormat who kept the house running. He laughed at his own remark, expecting others to laugh with him. A few relatives chuckled awkwardly. Others forced smiles. But the sting was immediate and deep. For a moment I froze, my fork suspended above my plate. The word echoed in my head, a dull roar drowning out the rest of the room. Doormat. He had said it as if it were a nickname, as if it summed up my entire existence in front of friends, family, and his business partner. My chest tightened, my ears buzzed, and I felt the air shift around me. Gregory gave a nervous laugh and muttered that it might be a little harsh. Rebecca shifted in her chair, staring at her plate, unwilling to defend me. My mother kept her eyes on her glass, pale and silent. The room swirled around me, the Christmas lights blurring into streaks of color. I clenched my hands beneath the table, willing myself not to cry. I felt the sting of 33 years pressing against my ribs, the forgotten graduation, the canceled birthday, the housewarming ignored, the countless holidays planned without acknowledgement, the money lent without return. It all crowded into that single word he had chosen. Doormat. The laughter faded into silence as people realized I had not joined in. My father still grinned, waiting for the moment to pass, but my stillness unsettled the room. I laid my fork down slowly, pushed my napkin onto the table, and rose to my feet. The scrape of the chair on the hardwood was sharp enough to turn every head. I lifted my glass of champagne, holding it steady though my hand trembled inside. My voice came clear, stronger than I felt. I said that my father was right, that I had been the family doormat for 33 years. The words sliced through the air, wiping the smile from his face. He stared at me as though unsure whether I was playing along or not. But I did not soften. I continued, reminding him and everyone else how many birthdays and holidays I had organized, how many hours I had spent cleaning, cooking, and fixing, how many dollars I had poured into problems that were never mine. I said it with a calm that surprised me, laying the truth bare in front of every guest. My father tried to interrupt, insisting it was only a joke, that I should not take things so seriously. Gregory muttered again that I was being too sensitive. Rebecca's voice joined in, suggesting maybe I was under stress from work. Each word they spoke only confirmed what I had always known. They would not defend me. They would protect the image of the family before they acknowledged my pain. I raised my glass a little higher and told them that if I was a doormat, then tonight was the last time anyone in that room would wipe their feet on me. The silence was absolute. Even the children seemed to sense that something had shifted. My mother's lips parted as if she wanted to speak. But nothing came out. The storm inside me broke then. Not with tears, but with clarity. I said I would no longer plan the holidays, no longer organize birthdays, no longer loan money that was never repaid, no longer carry burdens no one else wanted to touch. My voice did not waver. I set the glass down firmly on the table, and the sound rang through the stillness. My father's face had gone red. Whether from embarrassment or anger, I could not tell. He sputtered something about gratitude, about how much the family had given me, but I met his eyes steadily. I told him that giving me a childhood home and food to eat was the bare minimum, not a debt that required a lifetime of servitude. The words came easier now, each one freeing me a little more. Around the table, guests looked uncomfortable, glancing at one another, unsure if they should stay or excuse themselves. Thomas Green cleared his throat and muttered something about fresh air before slipping out to the porch. A few cousins followed him quickly. What remained was the core of our family, staring at one another in the aftermath of my declaration. My heart pounded, but for the first time in years, I felt the weight lifting. I was not invisible anymore. Every eye in the room was on me. Not in admiration, not even in love, but in recognition. They could no longer deny what I had carried for them. I stood tall, letting the silence linger. And then I gathered my purse from the back of my chair. I looked at the table one last time, at the decorations I had hung, the food I had prepared, the night I had orchestrated, and then I turned away, ready to let them sit in the discomfort of what had just been revealed. The air in the room was thick, heavy with things unsaid. My father called my name, his voice sharp, but I did not stop. I walked slowly toward the kitchen, each step deliberate, the sound of my heels clicking against the hardwood, marking the beginning of something new. The kitchen smelled of cinnamon and coffee, the faint hum of the dishwasher running in the background. Though it had not touched the mountain of plates already piled in the sink, I set my purse on the counter and steadied myself with both hands pressed against the cool marble. My pulse was still racing, and the echo of my father's voice lingered in my ears. But for the first time in years, I felt calm. I could hear the muffled voices in the dining room behind me. Frantic whispers. A chair scraping across the floor. The sound of glasses being set down quickly. I picked up my coat from the hook by the back door. The soft wool brushed against my hands, familiar and grounding. The sliding door creaked as I opened it, letting in a rush of icy air. The night outside was dark and still, the yard blanketed in fresh snow that glistened under the porch light. My heels crunched against the frozen ground as I stepped onto the patio. I breathed in deeply, letting the cold fill my lungs, cooling the heat that had risen in me at the table. The door opened behind me. My father's voice cut through the quiet. Sharper now, stripped of the humor he had used inside. He told me to come back, that I was embarrassing the family. I turned slightly, enough to meet his eyes in the glow from the kitchen light. His face was red, his jaw clenched, his shoulders squared, as if he could order me back into my seat. I told him simply that I was finished. He sputtered, insisting that everything I had was because of him, that children should respect their parents, that family loyalty was not optional. I listened, the words bouncing off me like sleet against glass. Respect, I told him, was not something owed, it was something earned. For years I had given him my silence, my time, my effort, and he had given me the role of servant. That was no longer enough. His mouth opened as if to argue, but I turned away, pulling my coat tighter, and walked toward the driveway. Inside, I could hear Gregory's voice rising, trying to smooth things over with the remaining guests. Rebecca murmured something about stress, about me being overworked. My mother's voice did not rise at all. That silence was louder than anything else. I reached my car, brushed the snow from the windshield with my sleeve, and slid into the driver's seat. The engine turned over slowly in the cold, then roared to life. For a moment I sat there, staring at the glow of the house through the windshield, the shadows of my family moving back and forth inside. Then I shifted into gear and drove away. The streets of Evanston were quiet, the fresh snow untouched, except for the tracks of my tires. Christmas lights twinkled from porches and trees, a cheerful picture that felt distant from the storm I had left behind. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. I felt light and heavy all at once, free from years of silence, but carrying the weight of every word I had finally spoken. At a red light, I pulled out my phone, saw the string of messages already flashing across the screen. A missed call from Gregory, a short text from Rebecca telling me to calm down, one from my mother asking me to please not make things worse. My father had not written, but I did not need him to. His silence had always been the loudest message of all. I dropped the phone back into my purse and let the light turn green. By the time I reached my house, the snow had begun to fall again, soft flakes swirling in the glow of the streetlights. I parked in the driveway and sat for a moment before stepping out. The air was biting cold, but it cleared my head. Inside, the house was quiet, exactly as I had left it that morning. I hung up my coat, slipped off my shoes, and stood in the stillness of my living room. The tree twinkled in the corner, the scent of pine filling the room. For once, the decorations were just for me. I curled onto the couch with a blanket and let the silence wash over me. The events of the night replayed in fragments. My father's laugh, my brother's smirk, my sister's silence, the word doormat slicing the air, and then my own voice, steady and clear, refusing to be erased. The storm inside me had broken, but what remained was not ruin. It was space. Space for me. Space for a life not built on being invisible. Hours later, long after midnight, my phone buzzed again. I ignored it. I closed my eyes and listened instead to the faint hum of the heater, the quiet ticking of the clock, the sound of snow against the window. For the first time in years, I was not making lists of tasks, not worrying about the next holiday or the next family demand. I was simply here, breathing, alive, and finally beginning to feel the edges of who I truly was. I drifted to sleep on the couch, the lights of the trees soft against the dark. When morning came, sunlight filtered through the curtains, pale and gentle against the snow. My phone sat silent on the table, the unanswered messages still waiting. I stretched, pulled the blanket tighter, and let myself smile. The choice had already been made. I had spoken. I had walked away, and there was no going back. The weight of 33 years had lifted, and though I did not yet know where this new path would lead, I knew it was mine. The first days after Christmas felt strange, as if the air in my house had shifted into something lighter. I woke without the weight of obligations pressing on me. There were no lists taped to the fridge, no reminders on my phone about catering orders or grocery runs. I made coffee and drank it slowly at my own table, watching the steam curl above the mug. For the first time in years, I felt like I could hear my own thoughts without the noise of everyone else's needs drowning them out. By Monday, my phone had filled with missed calls. Gregory tried first. His voice on voicemail was brisk, pretending nothing had happened. He said he had a client appreciation event coming up and needed someone to coordinate. He reminded me how naturally I handled those things, said it would only take a little time, and offered to buy me dinner as payment. I deleted the message without listening twice. Later that day, Rebecca called. Her tone was sugary sweet, layered with concern. But it was easy to hear the request hidden underneath. She told me she worried about me, that I had seemed tense at Christmas, and asked if I wanted to talk. Before I could answer, she slipped in the real reason. Her babysitter had canceled for the weekend, and she needed someone to watch Emma and Luke while she picked up extra shifts at the hospital. She said they loved their Aunt Maddie and would be so excited. My chest tightened at how familiar it all sounded. The guilt. The flattery. The assumption. I told her calmly that I had plans. I did not explain what those plans were. She sighed in frustration and said she would figure something out. Each refusal left me shaken at first. My old instincts screamed at me to give in, to keep the peace, to avoid conflict. But every time I chose myself, a new strength grew in the quiet that followed. That weekend I tested what it felt like to live only for me. I drove to the farmer's market downtown, wandering slowly between stalls, tasting apples and smelling loaves of fresh bread. I bought flowers for no reason other than I wanted them on my table. I spent the afternoon cleaning my closet. Not because anyone was coming over, but because I enjoyed the order of it. In the evening, I met David for dinner at a little Italian place near the lake. We lingered over pasta and wine, talking about everything except my family. When he asked how I felt after Christmas, I told him the truth. I felt lighter. Sunday morning, the silence stretched wide and beautiful. I made pancakes, stacked them high, and ate them while reading a book on the couch. No interruptions. No rushing. No obligations. For the first time in my adult life, I had hours that belonged completely to me. Still, the absence of noise made me realize how much of myself I had given away for so long. I thought of the nights spent hunched over lists of chores, the weekends sacrificed to errands, the vacations cut short to handle family emergencies. I wondered what I could build with all that energy, if I gave it back to myself. Work gave me the first answer, returning to the office after New Year's. I threw myself into projects I had always been too drained to volunteer for. My manager asked who wanted to lead a pitch for a new software client. And before anyone else could speak, I raised my hand. The old me would have hesitated, worried about balancing family obligations. The new me said yes without fear. That week I stayed late, refining strategies, sketching campaigns on whiteboards, rehearsing presentations. My coworkers noticed. Some teased me about turning into a perfectionist, but others admired the energy I brought into the room. My manager pulled me aside and told me he saw leadership potential. His words lit something in me I had not felt before, recognition that belonged only to me. At night I still thought of my family. I pictured Gregory fuming as he realized he would have to hire someone to manage his event. I imagined Rebecca scrambling to find backup childcare and paying for it out of her own pocket. I pictured my father sitting in his chair, nursing his pride and wondering why the house felt quieter without me filling the gaps. For years I had thought the family would fall apart without me. Now I realized it was not my job to keep them standing. One evening, my mother's number flashed across my phone. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something in me wanted to hear her voice. She sounded hesitant, careful, as if stepping across thin ice. She said she wanted to invite me for dinner. Just the two of us. No siblings. No father. She promised it was not about convincing me to apologize. She wanted to talk. I agreed, though I warned her gently that if it turned into another guilt trip, I would leave. She said she understood. When I walked into their house the following Sunday, the air felt different. The table was set simply for two. A pot roast in the oven. The smell of rosemary filling the air. My father's voice was absent. The house quieter. My mother poured wine, her hands trembling slightly. And we sat across from each other. For a long time she did not speak. Then she set down her fork and looked at me directly. She admitted she had failed me. She said she had stood by in silence too many times, letting my father diminish me because it was easier than arguing. She told me she had thought I was strong enough to handle it. But she now realized strength was not the same as being ignored. Her words stunned me. In 33 years, I had never heard her acknowledge the imbalance, let alone her part in it. My throat tightened. And for a moment I could not respond. I wanted to yell, to cry, to demand why she had left me alone for so long. Instead, I said quietly that I was tired of carrying it all. She nodded, tears glinting in her eyes, and whispered that she was tired too. We talked for hours, the longest conversation we had shared in years. She listened, truly listened. As I described what it felt like to be invisible, to have my achievements brushed aside, to be treated as the family's silent worker, she did not argue. She did not excuse. She simply listened and admitted that I was right. When I left that night, nothing was fully repaired. But something had shifted. I realized that speaking up had not only freed me, it had cracked something open in her too. For the first time, I wondered if she might find her own voice, as I had found mine. The drive home was quiet. The snow piled high on the sidewalks, the street lamps casting long shadows. I felt tired but steady, carrying the beginning of something unfamiliar. It was not reconciliation yet. It was not forgiveness. It was the fragile start of honesty. January settled in with gray skies and icy sidewalks, the kind of weather that made the whole town feel tired. At work, the year started fast. My manager called me into his office and told me the firm had landed a huge potential client, a Chicago tech company looking for a complete rebrand. It was the kind of project that could make or break careers. Without hesitation, I volunteered to lead the pitch. A year ago, I would have worried about balancing family obligations, but now there was nothing pulling me away. The days blurred into long hours of strategy meetings, late nights over mock-ups, and endless coffee runs. I felt alive in a way I had not in years. My ideas flowed, and my team listened. I noticed the surprise in their eyes, the way they realized I was more than the quiet coordinator who kept projects neat. By mid-month, I was standing in front of the client's board with confidence, delivering a presentation that left them nodding and smiling. When they signed the contract, my manager clapped me on the back and said, "It was the biggest win of the quarter." For the first time in my career, the recognition was mine alone. Meanwhile, the ripples of my absence were spreading through my family. Gregory's event at his firm was a disaster, without me to coordinate vendors. The catering was late, the sound system malfunctioned, and important clients left unimpressed. He called me afterward, his voice tight with anger. He accused me of abandoning him, of letting him look bad on purpose. I listened calmly and reminded him that I had never been his assistant. If he needed professional help, he should hire it. The silence on the other end of the line told me he was not used to hearing no. Rebecca was faring no better. She had been forced to pay nearly $400 for a last-minute babysitter when both she and her husband had to work. She texted me afterward, furious about how expensive it was, hinting that I had been selfish for not stepping in. I stared at the message for a long moment before replying that her children were her responsibility, not mine. She did not respond. Even my parents felt the absence. A week after our dinner, my mother mentioned casually that several family friends had called asking if my father had ever sent thank you notes for their Christmas gifts. He had not. Of course, that had always been my task. She sounded embarrassed when she admitted that she did not even know where to start. I could hear in her voice the realization of just how much I had been doing all those years, without complaint. The part of me that used to ache to fix everything felt strangely calm now. This was not cruelty. It was balance. Each of them was finally carrying what had always been theirs to carry. At the office, my world grew bigger. I was invited to networking events downtown, something I used to decline because family duties always came first. Now I accepted. One evening in early February, David and I walked into a sleek bar on Michigan Avenue, where industry leaders gathered. He looked at me with quiet pride as colleagues greeted me warmly, asking about my team's win. For once, I was not the shadow of anyone else. I was the one people wanted to talk to. Still, nights alone in my house sometimes felt strange. The silence could be heavy. reminding me of the years I had filled with constant busyness. But instead of dread, I began to feel possibility in that quiet. I filled it with books, with long walks even in the cold, with evenings spent cooking meals just for myself. Slowly I learned what I liked when I was not adjusting to everyone else. February brought another shift. My manager announced I was being considered for a director role. The promotion would not be final until spring. But he said my leadership on the tech project had made the decision clear. As I walked back to my desk, heart racing, I realized how much my family had taken from me by demanding my time and energy for their lives. And yet here I was, proving what I could do once I claimed my own. That weekend, while I was folding laundry and sipping tea, the phone rang. It was my mother. Her voice was hesitant, but softer than before. She told me Gregory had been furious since his failed event and had been blaming me to anyone who would listen. Rebecca had been overwhelmed at the hospital and was complaining constantly about how hard it was without me to help. My father had been snapping at everyone, unsettled by the changes in the house. Then she surprised me. She said maybe it was good that everything was falling apart, that maybe it was time they all saw what life looked like without me carrying the load. I sat on the edge of my bed, stunned into silence. My mother, the woman who had spent her life smoothing conflict, was finally admitting that letting go of me had exposed the truth. She said she was tired of pretending everything was fine. She wanted to learn how to stand on her own. The way I was standing now, when we hung up, I stared out the window at the bare trees in my yard. Their branches stretched against the winter sky. For the first time, I believed she might actually change. And even if she did not, I knew I had. The days grew longer. The snow began to melt. And with each week, I felt stronger. I was no longer waiting for their approval. I was building a life that was mine. March opened with sharp winds and gray skies. But I carried myself differently as I walked into the office each morning. The whispers about my possible promotion had turned into open conversations, and people looked at me now with respect instead of quiet assumptions. I felt taller somehow, as though shedding the old weight had stretched me into someone new. One afternoon, as I wrapped up a call with a client, I saw David waiting for me in the lobby. He held 2 cups of coffee and smiled the way he always did, calm and steady. He had come to take me out for a walk along the lake. Even though the wind whipped hard enough to sting our faces, we sat on a bench, clutching our cups for warmth, watching waves slam against the shore. He told me that he had noticed a change in me. My shoulders no longer curled inward. My eyes no longer darted, waiting for the next demand. He said I looked free. I did not answer right away. I let the words sink in. Free. That was exactly what it felt like. The freedom stretched further when I started saying yes to invitations I would have declined before. Coworkers invited me to a networking dinner downtown, and instead of worrying about who might need me, I went. A former college friend reached out on social media, suggesting a Saturday brunch, and I agreed. I joined a hiking group that met on Sundays, something I never would have imagined for myself. Each step on those trails reminded me that there was a whole world beyond family obligations. Yet my family was never far from reach. One Friday evening, Gregory called again. His voice carried that clipped tone he used when trying to stay polite while seething. He accused me of ruining his reputation at the firm by refusing to help. He said if I had been there, none of the mistakes would have happened. I held the phone to my ear in silence until he stopped talking. Then I asked him a question I had never dared before. When had he ever carried something for me? The line went quiet. And for the first time in my life, he had no answer. I ended the call, my hands shaking, but my heart steady. Rebecca's attempts came softer. She sent pictures of Emma and Luke playing in the yard, followed by a message asking if I could help next weekend. I stared at the photo, at their sweet faces, and felt the tug of guilt. But then I thought of all the nights I had rearranged my life for her and how she had never once offered to rearrange hers for me. I typed a simple reply. No, I cannot. The shock of my boundaries rippled through them. My mother told me over dinner one evening that the house felt different now. Quieter, but heavier. My father grumbled constantly, about how no one appreciated him anymore. Gregory snapped at her when she would not help with his paperwork. Rebecca grew short-tempered, arguing with her husband over who should watch the kids. My mother's voice was tired. But beneath it, I heard something new. She said maybe it was time everyone learned to manage without me. The irony was not lost on me. My absence had done more to expose the truth than my presence ever had. At work, the big promotion finally came. In early April, my manager called me into the conference room and announced in front of the team that I would be the new marketing director. Applause filled the room, and I felt my cheeks flush. But it was a warmth I welcomed. I had earned this, fully and completely, with no one else's shadow over me. That night, David took me to a small restaurant on the edge of the city. The kind with string lights in the windows and jazz humming softly in the background. He raised his glass and told me he was proud of me. Not just for the promotion, but for the courage it took to change my life. I looked at him, steady and kind, and realized he was the first person who had ever celebrated me without conditions. Still, family had a way of trying to pull me back. A week after the promotion, my father called. His tone was sharp, commanding. He said I had humiliated him at Christmas and owed him an apology. He reminded me that he had provided for me, that without him, I would be nothing. The words hit me, but they no longer stuck. I told him calmly that I did not owe him anything, least of all, an apology. I hung up before he could answer. My hands trembled after, but not from fear, from release. Spring came slowly, with buds on trees and sunlight stretching further into the evenings. I spent afternoons on my porch, watching the neighborhood kids ride their bikes, listening to birds return. Life no longer felt like something happening to me. It felt like something I was building, brick by brick, choice by choice. At the hiking group one Sunday, a woman about my mother's age struck up a conversation. She told me she had once been the invisible daughter too, the one who smoothed every rough edge for her family until she broke. She said it had taken her years to rebuild herself, but she was happier now than she had ever been. Her story stayed with me as we climbed the trail, her words echoing with each step. I was not alone. Others had carried this same weight and found their way out. By May, the warmth returned, and flowers bloomed in gardens across Evanston. My weekends filled with new rhythms. Brunch with friends, quiet mornings with coffee, long evenings with David. I still thought of my family often, but the thoughts no longer consumed me. They were part of my story. Yes, but no longer the center of it. One evening, while sitting at my desk with the window open to the spring breeze, I realized something I had never dared to believe. I did not have to prove my worth to them anymore. I had already proven it to myself. Summer heat rolled in early that year, the kind that made the air heavy even in the mornings. I walked into the office one Tuesday to find a bouquet of flowers waiting on my desk with a note from my manager congratulating me again on the promotion. Around me, coworkers buzzed about deadlines, but I sat for a moment in silence, letting the recognition sink in. It still felt new. The idea that I could succeed on my own terms without anyone else claiming the credit. Later that afternoon, while I was reviewing a campaign draft, my phone lit up with my mother's number. I considered ignoring it, but something told me to answer. Her voice was shaky. She told me my father had been taken to St. Francis Hospital the night before with chest pains. The doctors said it was a mild heart attack. Nothing immediately life-threatening. But he would need rest and changes to his lifestyle. She said he was asking for me. For a moment the old instinct surged, the one that made me drop everything and run. I gripped the phone tighter, my breath shallow. Then I reminded myself of the truth. He was being cared for by doctors. He was stable. My mother, Gregory, and Rebecca were all there. He was not alone, and it was not my responsibility to fix this. I asked calmly if he was safe. She said yes. I told her I would send flowers and wished him a smooth recovery. Her silence on the other end told me she had not expected that answer. That night I sat on my porch, staring at the stars while cicadas hummed in the trees. Part of me wrestled with guilt. he was still my father. And some childlike part of me wanted his approval. But another part, strong on all, knew that rushing to his bedside would not heal anything. The damage between us was not about a heart attack. It was about years of silence and disregard. I could hope for his recovery without sacrificing myself. 2 days later, I received a call from Gregory. His voice was sharp, accusing. He told me I was selfish, that our father was in the hospital and I had not shown up. He said family should stand together during times like this. I let him rant, then asked a question I knew he would not like. Where had he been when I was standing alone at graduations? Where was he when my birthdays were cancelled? When I carried Grandma to her appointments? When I planned every holiday? His voice faltered. He hung up without answering. Rebecca tried a different angle. She called and spoke in a softer tone, telling me the children missed me, that my father might not have many more years, and that I would regret staying away. I listened quietly, then told her regret came from years of being treated like I did not matter. I said I was not refusing to love them. I was refusing to be erased again. She sighed and told me I was making things harder for everyone. I replied that maybe it was time everyone learned how hard I had worked all along. At work, my focus deepened. I poured myself into projects, leading my team through tight deadlines, staying late because I wanted to, not because anyone expected me to. Each success felt like a brick in the foundation I was building. I no longer lived in the shadow of my family's approval. I was building a name of my own. In June, I was invited to speak at a regional marketing conference in Milwaukee. Standing on stage in front of hundreds of professionals, I told the story of a rebrand that had shifted an entire company's direction. Applause filled the room, warm and real. And afterward, people lined up to ask questions. I caught sight of David in the back, smiling proudly. That moment felt like a turning point. I had gone from being invisible in my family to being seen clearly by strangers. The same week, my father was discharged from the hospital. My mother called to update me. She said he was home but struggling with the changes. Frustrated by dietary restrictions and the need for rest. She said he had asked about me again. I listened, but I did not rush. Instead, I told her gently that if he truly wanted to see me, it would have to be on new terms. Respect, honesty, acknowledgement. She was quiet for a long time, then said she understood. When I hung up, I sat in the quiet of my living room, the summer sun slanting through the blinds. The guilt that once would have crushed me felt lighter now. I was learning that caring for someone did not mean surrendering yourself. I could wish my father well without stepping back into the role of servant. July arrived with blazing heat and fireworks over the lake. I spent the holiday weekend with David and friends, grilling on the beach, laughing until our stomachs hurt. For the first time in my adult life, I celebrated without wondering what my family needed from me. I watched the fireworks burst across the sky and thought to myself that this was what freedom felt like. Back home that night, as the sounds of the celebration faded, I checked my phone. A new voicemail from my mother played softly through the speaker. She said she and my father had started counseling. She said he was resistant, angry even, but the heart scare had rattled him. She said she did not know if he could change, but for the first time in years, he was trying. I sat in the dark, the message replaying in my mind. Maybe it would lead to nothing. Maybe it would change everything. For now, it was enough to know the cracks were finally showing. In the old walls of silence, August came with heavy air and long days that clung to the skin. At work, I was busier than ever, splitting my time between new clients and mentoring younger staff. Yet even with the stress, I felt steady. I had built a rhythm that belonged only to me. The noise of my family was still there, circling at the edges, but it no longer dictated every step. One evening, just as I was locking up my office, my phone buzzed with a call from my mother. Her voice carried something I had not heard before, a quiet steadiness. She told me she had started speaking up in her counseling sessions, admitting things she had avoided for years. She said she had told my father directly that his words about me had been cruel. For a moment I could not speak. I had waited my whole life to hear her defend me. And though it was late, it mattered. Later that week, I drove out to a park by Lake Michigan to meet her for lunch. She arrived carrying sandwiches in a paper bag. Her hair tucked back neatly. Her eyes tired but clear. We sat on a bench facing the water. She told me she had enrolled in evening classes at a local community college. Something she had wanted for years, but never dared to try. She said watching me carve out my own life had pushed her to imagine her own. Pride swelled in my chest, mixed with a sadness for all the time she had lost. Not long after, my father called. His voice was lower than usual. Stripped of its booming authority, he said he wanted to meet. Just the two of us. Somewhere neutral. He mentioned a coffee shop in downtown Evanston, one I used to study at in college. My instinct was to refuse, but something in his tone held me. I agreed. The day of the meeting, I walked into the cafe with my stomach tight. He was already there, sitting at a corner table, looking smaller than I remembered. His hair had thinned, his posture stooped, and the weight of age pressed on him. When I sat down, he looked at me directly for the first time in years. He said he had been wrong. He listed the things he had dismissed, the times he had used me, the way he had allowed Gregory and Rebecca to shine while I faded into the background. His voice trembled. But he did not look away. I listened, waiting for excuses that never came. He did not blame stress or culture or upbringing. He said simply that he had taken me for granted because it was easier. He said the heart attack had forced him to see how fragile everything was, and he did not want to leave this world without trying to make things right. My throat tightened. Part of me wanted to reach across the table, and part of me wanted to walk away. I told him words were not enough. I needed to see change. Not for a week, not for a month, but consistently. He nodded, his eyes shining with something close to humility. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about how strange it was to hear my father admit weakness. I did not know if he could truly change, but hearing him try felt like a crack in the armor he had worn my whole life. Meanwhile, Gregory and Rebecca were unraveling in their own ways. Through cousins, I learned that Gregory's reputation at the firm had slipped. He was no longer being considered for partnership, partly because of the failed event, and partly because he had grown careless. Rebecca was clashing with her husband, struggling to juggle her shifts without relying on me. Karma, it seemed, had found its way into the spaces I had once filled. One Sunday afternoon, David and I hosted friends at my house for a backyard barbecue. Laughter rose over the hum of the grill. Children ran across the grass, and the evening stretched, golden and easy. As I carried trays of food to the table, David stopped me, took the platter from my hands, and told me to sit down. He said hosting did not mean doing everything alone. I sat, feeling a rush of gratitude. It was the first time in my life that someone had insisted I deserved rest. As twilight settled, fireflies glowing over the yard, I realized I was living a version of family I had never known. Friends who listened, a partner who shared the weight, a life that did not require me to disappear. In early September, my mother called again. She said my father had been reading books recommended by his therapist, practicing small changes. He had even admitted to Gregory and Rebecca that he had been unfair, that they had leaned too heavily on me. I almost laughed, imagining their faces at hearing that. It was a small step, but it mattered. I hung up the phone and sat by the window, watching the streetlights flicker on. The past would never disappear. The hurt would not dissolve overnight. But for the first time, I could imagine a future where I was not only the family's shadow. I could imagine being seen. October brought crisp air and leaves that painted the streets in gold and red. At work, my days were full but steady. My team was thriving, and projects rolled forward with the kind of energy that once felt impossible. When my life had been crowded by family demands, I drove home one evening with the windows cracked, breathing in the sharp scent of autumn. When my phone rang, it was my mother. Her tone was urgent but calm. She told me my father had been admitted to the hospital again. this time for shortness of breath. The doctors said it was not another heart attack, but they wanted to keep him overnight for observation. I parked outside my house and sat in the car, my keys still in the ignition. Old patterns tugged at me, urging me to rush to the hospital, to sit at his side, to manage everything, but another voice, stronger now, reminded me that he was being cared for by professionals and surrounded by family. I did not owe them my panic. I asked my mother if he was stable. She said yes. I told her to keep me updated and hung up. The next morning, I sent flowers to his room with a simple card, wishing him strength. Hours later, Gregory called, his voice sharp and clipped. He demanded to know why I was not at the hospital. He said I was abandoning our father in his time of need. I let him rant until he ran out of breath, then told him calmly that showing up physically was not the same as showing up honestly. I said I would not pretend years of dismissal could be erased by sitting silently in a hospital chair. He cursed under his breath and hung up. Rebecca's approach was softer. As always, she left a voicemail saying that Dad kept asking about me, that he wanted to see me, that maybe this scare had changed him. I listened to her words twice, wondering if they were true or just another plea to pull me back into the role I had left behind. I did not return her call. That evening, David came over with takeout. We sat on the couch, cartons spread across the coffee table. While I told him about the calls, he listened without judgment, then said quietly that choosing not to rush to the hospital did not mean I lacked compassion. It meant I had boundaries. His words settled into me like warmth after cold air. A few days later, my mother called again, her voice softer this time. She said my father wanted to meet with me once he was discharged. Not at home, not at a family gathering, but somewhere neutral. She said he wanted to talk, really talk. He hesitated. Part of me was curious. Part of me braced for disappointment. I told her I would consider it. Meanwhile, my siblings faced their own unraveling. Through family whispers, I learned that Gregory's firm had passed him over for partnership officially. The failed event and his arrogance had left scars. He blamed me openly, telling anyone who would listen that I had sabotaged him. I almost laughed when I heard it. He was reaping the weight of responsibilities he had never carried himself. Rebecca struggled too. Her husband had taken a new job with longer hours, and she was drowning in shifts at the hospital while juggling the kids, without me as her silent backup. Cracks in her perfect image had started to show. One evening she sent a text, admitting she was exhausted, that she did not know how I had done it. All those years. For once, I did not feel angad here. I felt something close to pity. The call from my mother came again a week later. She said my father had chosen a small coffee shop near Northwestern's campus, the same one where I had spent late nights studying during college. He wanted to meet there on Saturday morning. I agreed, but I told her clearly that if it turned into excuses or manipulation, I would walk away. She promised she understood. Saturday arrived, cool and bright. I walked into the cafe, the smell of roasted beans wrapping around me, memories of late-night exams tugging at my mind. My father sat in the corner, wearing a sweater instead of his usual pressed shirt. Looking smaller, almost fragile, he stood as I approached, his movements slower than I remembered. When I sat down, he did not begin with a story or a joke. He began with an apology. He said he had treated me like a tool instead of a daughter, that he had dismissed my achievements, erased my sacrifices, and called me names that no parent should call their child. He admitted that he had leaned on me because it was convenient, because he knew I would never say no. His voice cracked as he said he was ashamed. I listened, my hands folded around my coffee cup, my chest tight. Part of me wanted to accept it. Part of me wanted to tell him it was too late. Instead, I told him the truth. I said apologies were easy, but change was hard. I said I would need to see him treat me differently. Not just in private, but in front of others. The way he had always praised Gregory and Rebecca while leaving me in silence. He nodded, his eyes damp. He said he wanted to try. For the first time in my life, he asked me what I needed from him. The question alone felt like a shift, though I held my heart steady against hope. When I left the cafe, the autumn wind caught in my hair. I walked slowly to my car, the crunch of leaves beneath my shoes. My thoughts tangled but lighter than they had been. I did not know if he could truly change. I did not know if our family could be repaired. But I knew this much. The choice was finally mine. Winter came again. The snow settling heavy on the roofs of Evanston. But this time, the season felt different. I decorated my own tree in the corner of my living room, strung with white lights and ornaments I had collected over the years. The quiet of the house no longer felt hollow. It felt chosen. I had built something steady. And for the first time, Christmas did not carry the weight of old obligations. My family sent invitations for dinner, and I considered them longer than I would have months before. My father had kept his word in small ways since our coffee shop meeting. He had called to ask about my work, not to talk about Gregory or Rebecca. He had even complimented me in front of relatives during a family brunch. My mother had arranged something I had never heard him do before. It was awkward, almost stiff, but it was change. Still, I chose not to go to Christmas dinner that year. I sent a gift basket and a note wishing them peace. But I spent the evening with David and friends instead. We cooked together, laughed in the kitchen, and toasted to the year ahead. The difference was stark. But it felt right. I was no longer the quiet helper who made everything perfect for others. I was someone who chose where to put my energy, and that made every moment brighter. In January, my mother called and told me she had finished her first semester of evening classes. She sounded proud, more alive than I had ever heard her. She said she was studying financial planning, and for the first time in her life, she was thinking about a career that was hers alone. I told her how proud I was of her, and I meant it. Gregory was still bitter. Word spread that he had been assigned to smaller cases, no longer trusted with high-profile clients. His arrogance had caught up with him, and there was no one left to cover the gaps. Rebecca had eased her hours at the hospital after clashing with her husband about childcare. She was learning, painfully, that her perfect image required real sacrifice, not just my invisible labor. I did not gloat when I heard these things. Karma has a way of balancing what we cannot. By spring, my own life was blooming. The promotion to marketing director had settled into a rhythm, and my team trusted me fully. I had begun mentoring young women in the company, sharing what I had learned about speaking up, about claiming space in rooms that would otherwise erase you. David and I had grown closer, planning small trips and talking about the future. For the first time, my life was not measured by what I gave away, but by what I built. In May, on the anniversary of that Christmas dinner, my father called. His voice was softer than I remembered. He asked if we could meet again. We sat on a bench by the lake, the spring air warm and full of birdsong. He told me he was still in counseling, that it was hard, but he was trying. Then he said something I never thought I would hear. He said he was proud of me, not for what I had done for the family, but for the life I had made for myself. The words landed like sunlight after a long storm. I nodded, not needing to say much. Some wounds never fully heal, but they no longer bled. A year later, I looked back and realized how far I had come. From the moment my father called me a doormat in front of everyone, to the night I stood and said no more, to the choices I made each day after I had transformed. I was no longer waiting to be chosen. I was choosing myself. Sometimes family learns when you draw the line. Sometimes they do not. What matters is that you learn. You learn that you are not invisible, not disposable, not something to be stepped on. You are worth standing up for. So if you have ever been the quiet one, the forgotten one, the one who carried the weight while others shined, I hope my story reminds you that it is never too late to speak. The moment you decide you matter is the moment everything changes. I would love to hear from you. Have you ever been in a situation where you had to draw boundaries with family or stand up for yourself after years of silence? Share your story in the comments. And if my journey resonated with you, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more stories about finding strength. claiming your voice, and creating the life you deserve. Thank you for listening. And remember, you are never just a doormat unless you choose to be one.